before we can move on to some of the other ways that your shell can be customized, we need to have at least a basic understanding of what an environment variable is. That's because many of the configuration options that you will be specifying later on in this module are in fact environment variables. So let's have a look at them. A shell environment variable is, well, it's a difficult thing to describe, but for the purposes of this discussion, it's a shell setting that can be viewed and adjusted at any time. It's an individual setting. It's a very small individual piece of information, like an individual word or an individual number. If you're a programmer, you probably have some idea of what a variable is. If you're not, it doesn't really matter. Just move on. Mistake, sorry. Sorry. We'll find out right now. Each variable is of the form name equals value. What that means is that each variable has a particular name, and each variable also has a particular value. I like to think of variables as little boxes. The box has a label on the outside of the box. That is the box's name, or in this case it's the variable's name. And then you can put things into that box, and what you put into that box is the value of it. And by using the equal sign, you're essentially saying that value goes into that box. In fact, that's actually the way that we go about creating or assigning shell variables. You do it on the shell command line, and you do it as follows. You simply type in the name of the variable, followed by an equal sign, followed by the value that you want the variable to have. Now, what does that look like? Well, you could type in the following, exactly verbatim. You could type in ps1 equals hello. And that would set the value of hello into the variable called ps1. So if you like, there's a box, and the box is called ps1, and inside the box is the value hello. Now what that means is that subsequently, later on, various programs, including the shell, will examine that box and go, I wonder if there is a box called ps1. Oh, there is a box called ps1. I wonder what's in it. Oh, something called hello is in it. Right, well that's the value that I'm going to use for my particular configuration setting. That's how it typically works. If you want a different configuration setting, then you set ps1 to have a different value. If you have an existing environment variable that you need to modify, you do it exactly the same way. You just simply type in the name of the variable and then you give it another value using the equal sign. If you have set an environment variable, or even if you haven't, and you want to find out the value of a given environment variable, you do it by typing the following. You type in the word echo, followed by a space, followed by a $sign, followed by the variable name. For example, that might be ps1. If you wanted to see the contents of the variable called ps1, then you say echo space $ps1. Let's see what that might look like. So if I want to find out the value of the variable ps1, I type in echo $ps1, and I'm doing P and S in capital simply because that's what this variable happens to be called. And I find that it's \u at \h :\w $sign. Now, I may or may not have any idea of what that means, but that is the value that is set into the variable called ps1. I'll give you another example. We have a variable called path, which contains the following. We'll be looking at path a little bit later on, and you'll fully understand what it is. We'll also be looking at ps1, so we'll have an idea of what both of those are. Now, what about a variable called name? Blank line, which means that either there is no such variable called name, N-A-M-E, or there is one and it contains just blanks. If I wanted to set one, I could say name equals Mark, like that, and then after that, whenever I do echo $name, I get Mark. So that will then show you how to set and examine environment variables. What else can we know about environment variables? Well, there's a program called set, which is used to show all the environment variables that have currently been set. Let's have a look. I type in SET, press enter. Gosh, that went past very quickly. Let's try it again and pipe the results to more. Okay, and there's quite a few of them, as you can see. They're being displayed in alphabetical order, and so on, and so on, and so on. So about 3 pages of them. Now, I wouldn't expect you to have the slightest idea what most of those do. I'm going to show you a few of them, but certainly won't be showing you the majority. Some of them are quite obvious, like there's one there called USER equals mVirtue. There's a little environment variable that contains my current username. There's also one just above it called UID, which contains my user ID. That doesn't mean that I can then go and change my username or change my user ID by modifying those shell environment variables. What it does mean is that someone somewhere, probably my shell program itself, is making those 2 parameters, if you like, available to any other program that might be interested. Notice that name equals mark is in there as well. That's the one that I just set. Shell variable names cannot contain spaces. So in other words, the PS1 bit cannot contain any spaces. However, the values can contain spaces. But if you wish for your shell variable values to contain spaces, you have to do it in a very special way. You have to enclose the value in double quotes, like you can see, PS1 equals hello there. So let's have a look at how that looks. We already know that name is set to mark, but what if I wanted to set name to, let's try that again, name equals mark virtue. Let's do it like that. And I get an error message, virtue command not found. What I have to do instead is name equals, and then put it inside double quotes like that. And now that works, and I echo $name, and I find that it's marked virtue. Now I said that there's absolutely no possible way that the environment variable's name, the actual NAME part that you can see above here, can contain spaces. So I can't say my name equals mark. I can't do that. Nor can I do the following, my name equals mark. That doesn't work either. It is simply not possible to have a space on the left-hand side of the equal sign. So we've seen how these environment variables are set and used, but what are they actually for? Well, many programs use these shell environment variables as configuration options, and the shell is one of them. For example, if you had an environment variable called temp and its value was set to be the directory /home/fred/temp, then that might possibly be the directory that various programs use in which to store temporary files. Adjusting the environment variable would cause the temporary files to be stored in a different directory. Now, every program is going to have its own particular set of environment variables that it looks at to determine the current configuration. Those environment variables can usually be found at the end of every man page. So for example, with a program called Vi, if you wanted to find out all the environment variables that Vi uses, you could look in the Vi manual page, usually right at the end. Please note that if you want an environment variable to be used by a program like Vi, it's usually not enough just to set the environment variable. You also have to export it as follows. You just export followed by a space followed by the name of the variable that you're trying to export. Note, do not put a $sign in there. For example, export PS1. Here is my name variable again being set to mark virtue. Now if I was to create another shell just using sh, and then I type in again echo $name, I find that it is blank. It's completely empty. But I did exactly the same thing. Notice that I'm actually running a second shell here. This is not my original shell that's running this. The second shell that I've just started has no knowledge at all of the original environment variable. So I'll now exit my way back to the first shell, and where I will find that the name is set. Now in order for the second shell or any subsequent shell to be able to examine name, I need to export name like that. And then I can create a second shell, and then I can do echo $name, and then find it is indeed set to mark virtue. I go back to the original shell, and it is set again to mark virtue. Now I use the second shell there as an example of any subsequent program that the shell might possibly start. Any program that the shell starts will not have access to the environment variables that you set unless you have exported that environment variable. So that's quite important. I'll now show you a few common environment variables that you might find being used on a regular basis in your shell and other programs. I'll just go through them quickly. Lines and columns are two environment variables that contain the number of lines and the number of columns on your current terminal. Let's have a look at the values of both of those. And you can see that I've just echoed the values, both of them out, and I have 24 lines and 79 columns. The variable called home is the name of the directory that is your home directory. This is quite an important environment variable because this is the location where all config files tend to get created. Not all, but most. Have a program like Mail, for example. When it starts up, it looks in your home directory for its configuration file. So does Vi. How does it know what your home directory is? Well, it looks at the environment variable called home. Home is also where the program called CD will go. If you type in CD with no arguments on the command line, it will go to the directory specified in your home environment variable. Log name, well, that's used by a few programs to determine the current username. It's used by Mail, for example, to know which mailbox to attempt to open. And that doesn't mean you can read other people's mail by changing your environment variable, because you actually have to have permission as well to read other mailboxes. And the Mail environment variable fully specifies the directory that contains the mailbox. The shell uses that environment variable to check in that mailbox periodically to see if it's changed. And if it has, it puts out a little warning on your screen saying you have new mail. The environment variable called mailCheck is also used by the shell to determine how many seconds it should pass between checks on the aforementioned mailbox. Now, Path and PS1 we're going to have a look at in the next two modules, so I won't talk about them here. Now, shell, that should be set to the actual file name that contains the shell that you like to use, like /bin/sh. That environment variable is used by programs like Vi and Telnet to obtain a shell session. If you started Vi, for example, or even Telnet, and you're using those programs and you want to obtain a temporary shell on the current machine, in the case of Telnet, the local machine I should say, then those programs actually examine the environment variable to determine which shell you like to start, and then they'll start that one for you. Also, there's an environment variable called term, which is your terminal type, which is an index into a vast database of terminal types that programs like the shell and various other programs look at to determine how to interpret keystrokes and other terminal-based options. I won't go into those in any more detail at the moment, but the next two modules deal with both Path and PS1.